two, one. Welcome to Sounding Point Podcast. My name is Joseph Christensen, and with me today is the music director of the Chicago Opera Theater, Lidiya Yankovskaya. Thank you so much for being with me today.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
And so, when I first met you, it was with this production of Iolanta in San Francisco. And as a violinist, I love playing in opera. I find it to be an extremely, it's an unusual kind of mode of performing, where a lot of times when you go into a symphony orchestra performance, you've rehearsed everything beforehand. Ideally, there are no surprises. However, in opera, it's very different. Every performance is different. And the the conductor plays this amazing balancing act between what's going on stage and what's going on in the pit with the orchestra. And when you play with a great conductor, that experience is seamless. The conductor is interacting seamlessly with what's going on stage. The musicians are notified of when they should come in and when they are doing things. And even though the interplay is totally dynamic and totally changing every performance, when you have that trust between orchestra and conductor, it's this really special kind of performance. So when I first played with you, I definitely felt that you had this amazing connection between the singers and the orchestra. Even though we had almost no time to rehearse in pretty sub-ideal conditions, you were able to sort of bring this performance together, which was amazing. And not only that, but on the breaks, you would be coaching the singers. So you would be sitting down and actually playing the score at the piano and singing through the parts with them. And as someone who's worked with a lot of conductors in opera, that was something I'd never seen before. I'm like, conductor and vocal coach, huh? This is amazing. So I thought that was a uniquely brilliant way of sort of interacting with musicians at all levels of opera. So that was just a pleasure working with you. And
It was a crazy time. So thank you. I was lucky to have an amazing instrumentalist in the pit because playing opera, of course, is not easy. Like you said,
yeah.
something new can come up at any moment. Things that you rehearsed a certain way suddenly go a totally different direction.
hmm
And especially with limited rehearsal time, you can end up in situations where a singer just forgets something, for instance,
hmm
or something happens on stage where the right prop doesn't come out at
hmm
the right time, or the set doesn't move at the right time,
hmm
and suddenly everything is thrown upside down. So it's great to perform with people who are ready for all of the curveballs and who are ready to adjust on the fly,
Yeah.
because that's what opera is all about.
Yeah. The in that performance, actually, shout out to Yuri, who is one of the other violinists in the opera. But I believe that one of the best opera performance stories, slash worst, that I've heard is that a prop sword at one perform. I forget what opera it was. A prop sword came flying into the pit and impaled her violin in the middle of a
Oh
performance.
no.
She actually had to get a new violin. Um,
Oh, that's
and
terrible.
I mean, I've never heard
Oh.
of that of an opera emergency like that. I'm sure you might have some other fun stories. But
Yeah, I'm afraid that it does happen sometimes. Was in a performance a couple of years ago, and the opera had this scene where the women's chorus was supposed to be gathering water. And the stage director had this brilliant idea that they would pretend that the pit was kind of the water source, and they were walking around with pitchers and scooping water out of the pit. And I actually saw this coming, so said in advance to the director, "Can you please tell them not to scoop out of the pit? I understand what you're going for. Just have them do it a few feet back. Nobody will notice." And that's what they did in
yeah,
rehearsal. But of course, for the performance, he said, "Just scoop out of the pit." And the props person was brilliant enough to get them real clay
Oh
pitchers, which
yeah.
sounds like a great idea, except one of the ladies of the chorus went up to the pit, started scooping the water, and the handle just broke straight off of the pitcher, and the pitcher fell directly between a cello and somebody's head. And if it were just half a foot in one direction or the other, either the head or the instrument would have been severely damaged. So we got very
Oh
lucky,
my God.
but it happens, and I've seen as an audience member also, but when things happen. I once saw a tenor fall into a pit,
Oh
so
no.
he was okay,
Okay, good.
but it can be exciting
It
down
can
there.
it can get risky out there. Man, I love that they had the dedication to detail to get real clay pictures so that the audience doubtless would totally appreciate from rows and rows away. That's perfect.
Yes, which again, it sounds like a great thing, but when they have the capacity to fall apart, it's not so
Oh,
great.
that's hilarious. Man, well, um, since I've seen you last, I believe you've had a baby, right?
I
So
did, yes.
congratulations.
Thank you.
And you've also become the music director of the Chicago Opera Theater. So congratulations on that as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
So how do you be a conductor right now? Can you just kind of go into what kind of how COVID has affected your life and kind of how you're responding to it?
Of course, yeah. I mean, it's so challenging, especially because as conductors, we don't make any sound. We rely entirely on the people we work with
Hmm.
to work with us to create music. So I've been playing some piano on my own, but it's just obviously not the same. I am very fortunate to have this position at Chicago Opera Theater. I also run an organization called Refugee Orchestra Project. And in particular with COT, we've had to reinvent and reimagine our season a number of times since this first happened in March. And I'm responsible for most of the artistic planning and casting and artistic sides of the company.
Hmm.
And at first, of course, we thought this might last a few weeks and we may have to cancel one production and then go on from there. And then we
Hmm.
thought, well, this will last through the summer. Then we thought
Yeah.
we might have to adjust a few things for
Oh my
fall. And
gosh.
now we have learned enough to have plans, so A through F,
Yes.
just in case. But that has certainly been a challenge as we're adjusting and figuring out, in particular with singers. Singers are considered super spreaders, and so the rules and regulations for how far apart singers need to stand in order to be safe. How we arrange the audiences. Of course, everybody's aware that it's so complicated in theaters in general with ventilation and flow of audiences and how do people get up to go to the bathroom and
Hmm.
all of those things. So a lot of my time has been spent really thinking creatively and outside the box. And actually, I'm really thrilled that we're able to have an outdoor concert with Chicago Opera Theater teaming up with Refugee Orchestra Project in Chicago at the end of August.
Wonderful.
Just a chamber ensemble outdoors, and everybody's socially distanced and masks, et cetera.
Hmm.
And but even that, even a small outdoor concert has involved so much more planning
Hmm.
than usual because we have to figure out how will people sit, how will we create bubbles within that seating
Hmm.
arrangement? How will we sanitize all the chairs between
Yeah.
performances? And of course, it's also a time when most organizations are understaffed and
Hmm.
underfunded and spread really thin. So that's been a big part of it. But for me also, I've loved this opportunity to just sit back and do all the things I feel like I never quite have enough time to do. In particular, as a conductor, I spend so much time on the road. I'm
Hmm.
constantly traveling. I travel with my family. And so it's a lot of work to get everybody from place to
Hmm.
place and settle down. And I spend a lot of time on flights and adjusting
Hmm.
to time changes, differences, et cetera. And so to be home for this extended period of time, I actually don't know in my professional career if I've ever been home or in one place
Yeah.
for this long.
Same.
And yeah, and it's been a wonderful thing. I focus, first of all, especially as an opera conductor, I really have to speak and or at least understand very well a number of languages.
Hmm.
And I've studied all of the opera. Russian is my first language, and then I've studied kind of all the opera languages, some of them more extensively than others. but it's very hard to keep them up.
Right.
And with language, you have to constantly be doing it in order to not forget it, even if it's a language you speak fluently.
Right.
And one of the things I've been doing is I've been doing these digital tutoring and just speaking to people for almost every day. Actually, I spend an hour in some different language just speaking to people abroad. And because everybody's home on their computers, it's easy to connect with a really great teacher in Germany or in Italy or in France or wherever, and just studying a lot of languages. I've been studying some scores that I haven't conducted yet and that I really love. Like I've been kind of going through the Mahler symphonies, some of which I've done, but many of them I haven't and probably won't for some time. But just pieces that I love and I can dig into. And I've also been connecting with people. Right before we started this podcast today, you mentioned how great it is to actually reconnect. And one amazing thing is I've spoken a lot to other conductors or other musicians who are people whom I know and admire and appreciate, but we never get to talk unless we happen to be in the same city at the same time. It's very difficult to meet up with other musicians. So that has also been an unexpected plus of this situation.
Yeah. Wow. I'm on the language front. So do you so you are not using like Duolingo or apps in that way? You're using tutors, right? Or how do you find it? Like, being partially fluent in English and being even less fluent in German. I like probably the most fluent in German I ever was just in my German class I took at college, and then it's been a steady drop off ever since. But I mean, I've always assumed that immersion is kind of the way of learning. So I don't know. What would be your advice for learning language?
I think it depends on the person, because every person learns things so differently. And I have a number of friends who speak many languages, and I find that everyone approaches it so differently. But for me, ultimately, it's a balance. It can't be just one thing. I don't do so well with apps unless it's a language that's brand new to me. So if I'm studying something just to get a basic sense of it. So if I'm traveling somewhere, like I'm going to Japan just on vacation and I want to be able to get around, maybe I'll use an app to get a basic hang of things. But I actually like thinking grammatically and analytically, which doesn't work for everybody. But I generally do a combination of I buy if I have something, if it's a language I've studied, I'll review grammar. And I have like right now, let's say French, for instance, which I studied really extensively from age 12 through the end of college and beyond. And I worked in France and studied abroad there. But you kind of lose some, especially grammatical concepts over time. So I've been systematically going through a high-level French grammar text and kind of doing exercises and forcing myself to think of it that way rather than just going on automatic, which is reminding me of some things that I do badly or do wrong or never really grasped in my studies. And then speaking to people, I find is really helpful. And because it forces you to really use it. It's one thing to do exercises or to understand grammatical concepts. It's a whole nother thing to use the language. Also, so often what you get in these books is not actually how people speak. So I've been spending at least 2 or 3 hours with different people, and I work with a number of different people purposely. I use actually something called italki, which is a really inexpensive way to find tutors abroad. And I just speak to people for an hour about different subjects. And while I speak to them, they'll say, you keep making this mistake, or you keep making this mistake, or this is really the more natural and contemporary way to say, you sound like you're an opera libretto. So, and it also forces you to kind of meet people and learn about different subject matter, which is also fascinating. And then in addition, I listen to podcasts, especially while I go jogging. It's an easy way to get some of the language while you're doing something else. And listening, for me, I've always found it the hardest thing out of language learning, especially because different people speak so differently and there's so many different dialects. So I try to do that as well.
Okay, I'm gonna try some of those.
It's a little of everything, yeah.
Yeah,
But again, it might not work for you. It's,
right.
I think, totally
I
different for
like
each
the idea
person.
of approaching it structurally, just so that you have the framework for it more. I mean, there's a lot to be said for just the get in there and start doing it as well, because that's probably the problem most of us have. It's just not even spending the time on it. So, but actually
But it's
having,
hard
yeah,
to get in there and start doing that. You have to be very brave.
hmm
And I think there's some people like that. My husband's actually like that. We'll travel somewhere and he won't have studied a language at all, but he'll very quickly just pick up basic
hmm
phrases. And that's the way he learns. For me, I won't open my mouth unless I feel like I can say at least some things eloquently.
right,
I'll just be afraid to speak up.
hmm
So.
that's cool. Well, that's awesome. You're using your extra time in quarantine for productive things like that. That's wonderful. So,
Also some unproductive things
yeah.
like just being at home and resting, and that's great too.
Yes, it
So,
is. That is also very necessary. So, yeah, tell me more about your concert coming up at the end of August.
yeah, so I run an organization, in addition to my work at Chicago Opera Theater, I run an organization called Refugee Orchestra Project, which celebrates the contributions of refugee composers and musicians to our culture and society throughout history and today. And Chicago Opera Theater a few years ago did Menotti's The Consul and got some funding from Opera America to continue some work that COT was doing in conjunction with that production of reaching out to local refugee communities. And we had been planning some projects for this summer. Already, of course, things kind of fell apart. And what we realized is that the most effective way would be to bring this organization that I already run together with COT in this performance. And we have performers from all over the world, some fantastic composers. And there are many classic composers that people don't realize were refugees. Donizetti was a refugee for a part of his life as he was escaping political persecution. For instance, Rachmaninoff is on there. We have people like Korngold, who may be better known
Right.
for this. Chopin is someone who had to leave Poland for France, right, and couldn't go back. We also have a wonderful composer named Melody Sufi who lives in New York City. He's 25. He came here from Afghanistan a few years back and is a very, very talented composer and actually also a painter and a poet, kind of an artist of all realms. And so we're performing some of his works and featuring a couple of singers. Amanda Majeski, who is a major soprano, lives here in the Chicago area. And we have a new young artist coming into COT named Nida Mutalifu, who is Uyghur. She's
Wow.
from that group in northern China that's been very much persecuted. And so it's a wonderful opportunity to just showcase how, and I think right now more important than ever, to showcase how important cultural exchange is,
Yeah.
how important it is for us to come together, to welcome people from other places and to make music together and to have this sharing of our cultural wealth. And in particular, when it comes to music, this is so important because music is it's a universal language that we can all, not to spout the cliche, but it is a way for all of us to connect no matter where we come from. And I think that's very important. And at a time when most borders are closed, when for the first time in a very long time in our history, we can't travel freely to most of the world, I think it's become more important than ever for us to celebrate the wealth of culture within our world together in this way.
Wow. That's yeah. This is quite. I mean, what do you even say? This time is so bizarre. It's amazing that this project you're giving people with this background as refugees a voice and an ability to express themselves. What do you see? I think this is a topic that's been coming up a lot for classical musicians, and I mean just musicians in general. They're like, what is our role right now in social change? Like what can we do in a way? I feel like there's this
Yeah.
weird thing where artists, in a way, art is very self-contained, and we judge art in many ways by its own standards, or like, and that's beautiful, right? We think of, I don't know, what some in a way music feels safe because when we're doing it, we get to focus on these beautiful musical things like interpretation and intonation and technique and all these things that go towards actually making the music better, right? But then also it has this social dimension. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think about our role?
Well, I think art and artists, and in particular music, are better positioned than just about anything else in our culture to enact the kind of social change that we're looking for right now. In particular, when it comes to the representation of plurality of voices, when it comes to people coming together and doing something together at a time when there is so much hostility, I think, around us in so many ways. Um, as musicians, I think the way we're trained is really the problem, in particular in the so-called classical music realm. So often the focus is on technique. And part of that comes with how do you achieve traditional success, or at least forget traditional success, how do you get jobs
Yeah,
in classical
exactly.
music? And the way, because it's so competitive, because there's, especially in this country, it is so competitive, there are so many people who are on such a high level and so few jobs, that it ends up being about this technical agility or something that can be judged on a more objective level, right? Because so much of music is subjective, and as a result of that, the way we're trained is that there's this focus on these objective things, like your intonation being absolutely perfect
Yeah,
at every moment,
yeah,
your fingers moving really quickly, knowing all those orchestral excerpts, whatever
yeah.
it is, at any moment. But in reality, music is not about that. All of those technical things are important, but they are a tool. They're not an end in and of themselves. They are a tool to reaching an audience, to creating great art so that we can impact the people who are hearing this music that we're making, right? That is really what it's all about. Are we impacting the audience, or are they totally uninterested in what we're doing? And I think as a result of how our field is structured, especially in the US, as a result of how our training is undertaken in response partially to that structure, we forget that ultimately it's about impacting change. It's about impacting that audience and making them feel something. But I think that once we come back to remembering that it is about that impact, it's about serving our communities, it's about serving our audiences, it's about making people feel something and come together in some way, because that's what's great about art. I think as soon as we keep those goals in mind, everything will change. Because this is an art form, music in particular is an art form that allows us to reach so many different kinds of people. And I think many of the problems that we're seeing have to do with the structure of our organizations, have to do with our mindset, have to do with systemic issues that have been there historically for generations and generations. But none of the problems, I think, are really in the art itself. And we can only welcome more art. There are problems in art that we've neglected, for
Right.
instance, but there is so much great art for us to make, and so many people in this country in particular who make that art, who have the ability to make it on such a high level, and who have the ability to bring so many different perspectives to the table. And that's really exciting. And I really hope that this moment will bring us back to the core of our mission. I think, again, even during this moment, it's really easy to get stuck on just the material things, rather than remembering that it's about impacting our audience.
That is so. It's so funny just hearing you talk about that. In a way, it sounds like the most obvious thing in the world. Like, oh yeah, we're supposed to connect with people. But it's so funny. Like as a violinist, You're talking about like the years of training and everything. I'm like, oh my god. I'm just thinking of all the pressure I've put on myself and all the sort of the conditional difficult. And I'm complaining. I'm coming from incredible privilege to be able to do this as a living, but there is incredible pressure on musicians today to achieve like this
And
high
I
standard.
think when we achieve a high level of proficiency, also for most of us as students, especially, like we're so stuck on just doing it the right way, right? And it's usually, at least for me, that was the case. It was once I really, maybe in graduate school or maybe even after, at some point, something happened and I just realized, oh, it's not about
Yeah.
these technical things. And partially I was able to realize that because I got to a point technically where I was comfortable,
Hmm.
but it shouldn't have to be that way necessarily. And what I've realized over time is that the greatest musicians and the people my colleagues whom I admire the most are the people who in their core remember that it's not about just the technical
Hmm.
things. It's about that connection with the audience, even while they worry about the technical things, that they
Right.
see them as a means to an end.
Hmm.
And even when we know intellectually that's the case, and of course we all know intellectually that that's the case, really feeling that is
Hmm.
a totally different world.
That's that is yeah. It's definitely there was a not to go on too much of a tangent, but there was a violinist who lived near where I did growing up. His name's Gilles Pop. He was this French violinist, kind of a crossover um, guy. And I remember back in the day, his website had this whole section on it called "On Removing the Mental Contagion Acquired at Music Conservatories," and it was basically that. It was basically that idea, where it's like the tools and the excellence is so we see it around us. We're surrounded by it in conservatory. We want to achieve it so much, but then to become consumed by that um, to be consumed by that attitude of, oh, I need to reach these standards in this and this way, then forget the core, forget the musical expression, is yeah, it's a danger. It's our occupational hazard. But
And
no.
to be fair, I think it's getting better. I mean, for example, I've had some conversations recently with Aubrey Bergauer, who is at San Francisco Conservatory, who's doing some amazing work on making sure that that it's not just conservatory training, right? And that it's this narrow path, but that conservatory students are aware of what's happening in the greater world, that it is a dialogue, right, between different people. And I think there's so many conservatories that are making some of these changes. At New England Conservatory for some time, they've also been ensuring that their students, for instance, go out into the community and do certain kinds of projects that people connect to the rest of the community, to their listeners, to their
Hmm.
audience. And I think that's very important. And I do believe the mindset is shifting for musicians, which is really important.
That's wonderful. I was part of a panel recently with Classical Revolution. Shout out to Cherith. And basically there were some other musicians and conductors there. Um, and basically the topic was many of the issues arising from the COVID-19 situation, and separately throughout the panel, I think people brought up the two issues a lot of, well, how do we get more young composers? Like, how do we challenge, or not challenge, but change our idea of canon so that we create more room for contemporary composers to enter into this space with symphonic repertoire, and also separately, how do we open our field to a more diverse performer base and more audience? How do we get more people of color involved and welcomed into our world? And it struck me that it's really the same issue, right? We need.
Well, and I think Yeah, it is. It's the same. It is the same problem, and it also is the same problem as who is on the administrations of our organizations, right? It's systemic and it's in all areas. Who's on the boards of our organizations? But you mentioned the idea of the canon, and I think part of it is that it's that we have this view, or the way we've been taught is that the canon is the canon because these are the best
Mm-hmm.
works. But it doesn't work that way. Even if you just talk about the classical canon, it's always evolving. Bach, for a time, was completely unknown until another composer brought his music to the forefront. Now he's seen as the greatest composer of all time by
Mm-hmm.
most musicians and by so many. There are other works that are part of a canon for 50 years and then they disappear, and then maybe they come back. And this is even talking about kind of the quote unquote classics
Mm-hmm.
that we discuss. But there are so many other works, of course, that have been ignored or neglected or for some reason didn't make it into the so-called canon in the first place, or maybe did and then got taken out. Why does the canon as we know it exist? I think it exists because it makes people's jobs easier, both for the audience, for the conductors or whoever's programming certain things, for the performers. It's much easier to say, oh, I need a piece for this instrumentation. Let's see, I need to program something with double winds that fits, that's 13 minutes long, that'll fit into this part of the program, because inevitably we have to worry about so many
Mm-hmm.
considerations that are non-musical when programming. It needs to be upbeat to balance this other thing on the program. So what can I program? Well, I'm just going to go back to the composers that I know and love, and I'm just going to go back to what I think of as the canon, or I'll even pull off that book off the shelf that, for instance, conductors often use this book called The Daniel's Guide that's basically just a list of quote unquote canonic works, which is problematic. It makes people's jobs easier. It is much harder to actually be fully aware of what's out there, to do your homework, to dig for work, be it old work or new work, to be on the lookout for the composers that are up and coming who have the most distinct, exciting voices, to really take your time and search and dig and find and bring new things to your audience that are good. Because the thing that happens in between is you have the people who program the canon, then you have the programming of, I'm going to program things that are off the beaten path just because they're off the beaten path, but I won't really take the time to dig in and find what's great, right? And then sometimes you have audiences who hate contemporary music and they say, oh, I hate all new music, but it's really because what they've been hearing is either only one kind of taste. That can also be problematic. That may suit some of them and not others. Or they may only be hearing that 10-minute program opener,
Right.
and nothing more substantial.
Yeah.
And those 10-minute program openers may be just whatever the publisher sent that day, right, as a point of reference. And it takes a lot more work to program in an inclusive way. And it takes a lot more work, the same for recruiting administrators or musicians or anybody else. It takes a lot more work to find the right people, because the people and the works and the things that you really want are often the ones that you have to really put effort into finding. And I think the majority of people just don't want to put in that time, or feel that they don't have that time, or don't feel that it is their responsibility.
Maybe now is a time where people have more time and they can actually start to think about this more. And
Absolutely. And I actually think that's affecting the field in a very positive way, that people are digging in and actually learning. Not everybody has more time. Also, to be fair, there are people who have to work harder than ever and juggle families or deal with other challenges of today. But I think some do. And those who do, even just by cutting out their commute time, and those who do, I think are taking the time to dig into new repertoire, to do research, to discover something that they hadn't known before, which is so important.
And the as you've kind of said, the impetus for change and the ability to do so lies a lot of the time in classical music. Obviously, there's a couple different avenues. I play in a string quartet. It's very small, obviously, we're very agile, but there's also, you know, there's a limited amount that we can accomplish on our own as four people. But then with a symphony orchestra, for example, or an opera company, you have this bigger organization. You have a little more power to influence the arts in your city and your region and the country. And then you also have music directors. You have the board. You have it's all in a way. There's these gatekeepers who have traditionally upheld this idea of canon and traditionally upheld this form of classical music we're familiar with. So now, kind of what you're saying, I mean, you're using your platform as a music director to help influence. Like, you know, we wouldn't have Bach today in the way we have him without Mendelssohn, and he was the music director or whatever they said back then of the Gewandhaus, right, in Leipzig. So that's like an early example of someone in an influential position who used his platform to put out someone who he believed to be valuable. And then now, obviously, the music world is unimaginable without him. So,
well, but one of the challenges today also, I think, even back in the time of Mendelssohn, as far as I understand, I think Mendelssohn, it seems to me, had a lot of autonomy. I am very fortunate that I also work in an organization that is open and will go along with the things that I propose. That we have a board and a staff who are very open-minded, who are interested in changing the field and moving it forward. That is very fortunate, and it's in many ways unusual. One of the challenges is that it takes more than one person. It really takes everybody, because music, orchestral playing, opera, any of this, it is a collaborative effort by nature, and people need to buy into what we're doing in order for it to function. And in particular in the United States, our funding structure makes this very challenging. We tend to be very risk averse especially in our large institutions, because taking a risk can cause the collapse of an institution very quickly. Even large institutions are often in positions that are much more precarious than I think most people realize. And so what happens in opera companies, for instance, will mount, even large opera companies, usually it's 6 operas a year or so at the most. And you can't afford and you can't take the risk of having 1 or 2 of them be a flop.
right.
And certainly not many of them being a flop. And so we go back to what we know. We go back again and again to what we're familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, so many classical musical organizations rely on a small number of donors who give a very large amount of money. The people who can afford to do so or who can support the arts in this way usually are people who have been around for a really long time. They're great music lovers. They're very generous. They have been in the industry for a very long time. But partially because they've been here for a long time, again, they have an opinion about what works, because it's what they've seen work in the past.
Right.
And that can also be challenging for organizations, because again, at COT, we're very lucky that our biggest donors are also very open-minded. But partially we can be this flexible because we're in a city with other major institutions that provide people with the canonic repertoire. And so we can push the boundaries. There's also nothing wrong with presenting canonic repertoire. A lot of this repertoire is fabulous
Mm-hmm.
and really great and deserves to be heard again and again. I think the problem is when we see that as our only option and when we don't balance that repertoire very carefully with other works. And in my opinion, new work should be perhaps even on the upper, we should have more new work in some ways than older work. We should have work that's reflective of our times, because all of that old work, when Verdi was writing his music, most of what you saw at the Opera House was new.
Mm-hmm.
It was the work of the day, of the time. And that's the case in most arts industries and fields. And I think somehow in the middle of the 20th century, we got stuck. And partially we got stuck because of this funding structure, because of the way our organizations must be, or at least feel that they must be risk averse in order to to succeed. And part of it, again, goes back to what I said about doing the research and taking responsibility, because to take the risk, you have to be really confident that the thing you're taking the risk on is great,
Right.
and that it's going to be successful. And I think many people feel that don't have that confidence, or don't have the time to do the research to have that confidence, or maybe don't feel that they have all the training necessary to make those calls, and that's also challenging.
Right. Wow. That's what if you're a conductor and you're looking for a a new composer or a new opera to put into your season. How do you find that?
Great question. And it's a number of ways. So one is that I make a point of making sure it is possible for people to contact me. And composers will send me things all the time. I think there's so many artists whom you really can't get to. You have to go through 10 layers of publicists and managers and whoever, and assistants and whoever else, and you just can't get to that person. And by the time you email all those other people, right, the artist will never actually see the work.
Yeah.
And that's problematic, because that in a way is also a way of gatekeeping and keeping people out. And I make sure that it is possible for someone who, if they really want to, they can get in touch with me and they can send me their materials. I get a lot of stuff. I don't look at it right away every time, but at least a few times a year, I sit down and I look through the pile of things, or maybe occasionally I'll just glance at something and I'll say, oh, this looks interesting, but it's not, I don't have any kind of platform for it right now, so I'll put it aside and maybe I'll look at it ages later. And I think sometimes also when artists do this, they think that their stuff just gets tossed to the side. And I'm sure there are some people who just toss it to the side, but there are many others who, like me, do look at it, may not have the time to respond to every single person with detailed comments on their work, because that would take an enormous amount of time, but did glance at it and is either keeping it on the shelf for later, or has it in mind, or will remember your name next time they see you, or maybe thought, well, this isn't quite what I'm looking for, but maybe next time this person contacts me, I'll remember what they sent my way. So that's one way. And I really do take the time and see it as part of my responsibility to look at all these things that come my way. The other way is through networks of people I trust. And what's important there is, what kind of networks do you have, right? Because I think everybody relies on their networks of other artists when programming, or when choosing repertoire, or when seeking new talent. But your network could be made up of a lot of people who are just like you, or people who are in very high up positions by the time anything gets to them already, it's gone through, again, all of those gatekeepers. I make a point of having a network of people I trust who are not just working on the highest level. Some of them might be. Some of them are doing grassroots work. Some of them are running storefront organizations. Some of them are training young talent in conservatories or universities, or maybe even in totally non-traditional training spaces. And I reach out to my network and I make sure that people are aware that I'm always looking for work. And if I'm looking for a type of piece that I think maybe somebody within any of those levels might have some access to, I reach out to them. The same thing for administrative positions, when we have something, even something I'm not directly responsible for. So for instance, at Chicago Opera Theater, I'm not directly responsible for hiring our staff. But if I know we have a position opening up, that maybe there are people out there who are really qualified, who would not be the typical candidates, or who might not be the ones following on Musical America or wherever we post the jobs, I make sure to reach out to some of those networks and say, just FYI, we're doing this thing, or to reach out to people I've encountered who maybe would be interested in something like this. And that, again, it's extra effort, but I think it is the responsibility of each and every single one of us to do this kind of work, and to take the extra step to seek out the right people, and also to give opportunities. Because I think the other thing that often happens, especially again in this risk-averse classical music world, is that we feel that everyone we hire, every piece of music that we play, or every composer to whom we give the opportunity, must be that flawless idea of whatever we have in mind. But it doesn't actually work that way. And in my experience, sometimes the people who check off all the boxes aren't actually the ones you want. And I make a point of also realizing that there is such a thing as potential and rising to the occasion, and being really seeking people out who I think are really bright and really driven and have really great ideas. And maybe they haven't figured this out or that out yet, but I really believe that they could rise to the occasion, especially if given the right tools. And that's the other place where people fail. Sometimes I see this, the following happen. So sometimes an organization will identify, let's say, a composer who's really promising, really bright, very inexperienced. And then in particular with opera, I see this all the time because opera is so hard. It is so hard to write opera. There are just so many things involved. And then they don't give this person any tools, and they just say, oh, write an opera for us. And it ends up flopping, and then they say, well, I guess they just weren't up to the task, or I thought they could rise up to the occasion, but they just couldn't, so too bad, goodbye. And then this individual doesn't get more opportunities. But it is our responsibility, especially if we take a risk on someone, to give them the tools they need to succeed. And that, I think, is also very important.
That's a fascinating idea of, I mean, being aware that an emerging artist can be set up for success or set up for failure, and that
Exactly.
if you are helping them, you really want to give it the best shot.
Well, and I think also and this goes back again to the way we're trained, to that you either can do it or you can't do it, right? There's this black and white thing. But I even think about myself when I was just starting out. There's so many things that I didn't know or did badly that I do well now. And partially because I did them really badly, I kind of figured out how to do them, and I can do well now. And I think often if someone does something badly, we just write them off. Right. And I think that's important because in particular in music, it's such an endless pursuit. And we're always all learning and all getting better and all figuring out new sides of our art and ourselves and what we do. At Chicago Opera Theater, we have a program for composers called the Vanguard Composer Program, where I work with opera composers, emerging opera composers. And emerging opera composers, in some cases means composers who are very established in other fields. So our composer who just graduated, Stacy Garup, is an exceptionally accomplished symphonic composer. She's been performed by major symphonies. She's incredible. She's an amazing orchestrator and a thinker and an amazing musical voice. But she had never written an opera or spent time in opera rehearsals. She really wanted to. But if you haven't lived in the theater, it's very hard to write a successful theatrical work because that's a whole different side of it. And there are other composers I've come across who come from just a totally different world. I worked with one composer recently, Exley, who comes from kind of from DJing and house music, and again, a totally different world, but brought that to classical instruments mixed with electronics in a way that was not like anything I'd ever heard. And that's also really valuable. So seeing all of these different sides, I think.
That's wonderful. I think it's very encouraging to a young artist to get that support from someone, and almost like that vote of confidence, and to be validated in that way, even if you're not traditionally from that field. I mean, even if like I started out like as a fiddler, a bluegrass fiddler, and
That's great.
I just remember, yeah, I mean, a few teachers, a few mentors, a few people who believed in me made all the difference, and so that's really cool that you're giving that opportunity to some people through the Vanguard Initiative and other things.
Well, and I imagine that your fiddling brings something to your playing also that that other people don't bring, because all music is interconnected, and having experience in bluegrass can inform your classical playing in a totally new and interesting way that can set you apart.
My teacher Axel, because I think I was working on Sibelius or some difficult violin concerto, and I was so tight, and my teacher, Axel Strauss in undergrad, he would have me just stop, and he was like, okay, play Red Haired Boy, or like play Soldier's Joy, or play one of these like old fiddle tunes, and I would. And he's like, okay, now play Mendelssohn again. Anyway, his
That's
point
great.
was just like, you know how to do this. It's loose, it's fluid. Like you have to play it as if you're inventing it. You have to play it as if you're improvising. So that was really that helpful.
I
So
love that. Great teacher.
yes, he was. So I wanted to ask you. We're coming up on an hour here. We're doing great. And yeah, so I was just wanted to ask you kind of about your background as a pianist and vocalist. Like, how did you get started in your musical life?
So my mother, who is an engineer by training, loves music, and she studied piano and voice when she was younger. And I think she probably would have pursued music, but it was strongly discouraged by her parents, and she ended up going into a different direction. But as a result, she surrounded me with music when I was a kid. So we always had great recordings playing. I grew up in St. Petersburg, Russia, which has so many musical institutions with inexpensive tickets, and it's normal for children to go to all kinds of performances. And so I was taken to concerts starting at, before I can remember. I was going to all kinds of concerts and all kinds of performances. And I started playing piano when I was 6, and when I was 5, I started singing with a children's chorus in St. Petersburg. It's a children's chorus of radio and television, which was this very intensive chorus. At age 5, I had to learn how to know how to sight read in order to get in. I mean, it was like do, re, mi, re, do. It wasn't anything complicated, but you had to have some sight reading skills, and we rehearsed multiple times a week for several hours.
Wow.
And it was very, very intensive and very disciplined, which I think I struggled with as a kid. I actually got kicked out of a concert once because I kept talking and not paying attention during rehearsal, and they told me that I have to sit out a concert, which was a great learning experience, I think. But I was very lucky to start in Russia, I think, because the music education system there is very holistic. So as a child, when you start playing an instrument, if your primary instrument is not piano, you take piano as a secondary instrument. Piano was my primary instrument. So, and everybody had to sing in an ensemble or play in an ensemble. So again, if you don't play an orchestral instrument, you have to sing in a chorus or do some sort of ensemble playing. We had twice a week, we would meet for music theory and basic history, and it's all seen as one. So as a kid, you learn how to play chord progressions or basic kind of transposition and basic chord progressions in harmony. It's not just theoretical, and it's related to your performance, which I think often here, the music education is approached in a way that everything is very separate. And having that base really early on, I think was extremely helpful because it allowed me throughout my life to continue to think of things in a more unified way, to tie harmony into what I was actually performing as opposed to kind of a theoretical study on its own. To tie performing in a vocal ensemble to how I was playing on the piano, or et cetera. And when we moved to the United States, I also took up the violin, and I played violin actually through the end of college, but it was always a secondary instrument for me. And I actually, a couple of years ago, I donated my violin because it sat in its case for years, and it was just not fair to the instrument. But I still play piano. And I played very seriously. In high school, I had some wonderful teachers, mentors who were duo piano. They were husband and wife, but they performed duo piano repertoire, Vladimir Pleshakov and Elena Winter. And they didn't really have students, but my best friend in high school was also a pianist, and he came up to them after a concert and just said, will you teach me? And they ended up taking him on, and he tagged me along, and the two of us would go once a week, and we would spend an hour and a half with one teacher, and he would be with the other, and then we'd flip.
Oh, wow.
And so it would be these really long lessons with two different people also over the course of kind of these long lessons. And they were both musicians, also I think partially because they were primarily performers who were at the end of their performing careers. They were really interested in approaching music in a really holistic way. For me, that was life-changing. And when I got to college, I actually wasn't sure I wanted to study music. In fact, I was sure I wasn't going to pursue music professionally at first, because I didn't know what I would do in music. The path for me would have been as a pianist, but I didn't want to be a concert pianist. The many endless hours in a practice room alone just were not for me. I knew that I loved working with people. I wasn't sure that teaching was right for me. I had done some teaching at that point, and I enjoyed teaching, but it wasn't me. And so I studied philosophy and music, and I studied languages, and I studied other things. But when I had the choice, I always chose music, I found. And I was conducting already at that point, but I didn't really realize that it's a career that you could have, or that it's a thing that you can do. It was something that I did, but I didn't think of it, I think, in a long-term way. I'm not sure why. Maybe because I didn't really know many conductors, or personally, it seemed like this far-off thing that somebody else who wasn't me did. But I had opportunities. I was lucky that I was given opportunities to conduct a lot. And I found my calling in it. I found that in conducting, I did the things that I loved the most, which was working with people, bringing people together, thinking about music in a way that related everything that I was performing to culture and society and language and literature. And that's really, for me, was the most exciting thing, that I could bring people together and also create organizations and shape something. I like to build things. I like to shape things and build things. And I like to work with other people. And I also like that the responsibility wasn't all on me. And that made me a better performer. As a pianist, I found it so stressful to have it be just me and this piano and all of these notes, right? And there's just so many notes, and it is so stressful, and there's so much technically and intellectually that you have to put together, and it's all just on you. And I found that extremely difficult from a kind of a mental health perspective. And as a conductor, I don't have to look at the audience, first of all, at all. And I just can bring people together and trust them to do their work well and help them do their work well, which is my job. But if I miss a note, I don't have to feel like if I miss a note, it's all over, which is the thing we were bringing it back to what we started with. That was part of my training as well. And it can be very challenging to get past that. And as a conductor, I was able to just think about the music, just think about impacting the audience and bringing the musicians together. And that was very exciting.
I remember... I'm just curious as a performer, as someone who hasn't ever really conducted before, because you mentioned kind of getting nervous for playing solo, and obviously when you are playing solo, there's no one else there. It's all on you. So there's definitely this feeling of pressure. But I'm wondering, do you get nervous when you conduct?
Never.
Wow.
Which is interesting. Never. As a pianist, I would often get very nervous, and I played my entire life. You'd think that after a time, but maybe it's because of that I started at age 5 and I was playing these giant pieces, and I better be good, right? I put all this time and energy, and I practiced for 7 hours a day for months to get this ready. I better be good. I don't know if it's that, or it just starts to be a habit, but as a pianist, I often got very nervous, and still I play often, mostly accompanying singers. I never get nervous coaching singers, like what you were talking about with Yolanta. I can jump down at the piano and coach singers through a thing. If suddenly I'm performing with a singer and I have a long solo passage, that's inevitably where things go wrong. As a conductor, interestingly, I never get nervous. I think as a conductor, I'm able to, for some reason, it's on the piano, I can't do this, but as a conductor, I'm able to totally just focus on the music making and solving the problems at hand. And again, I think it's because it's not on me in the same way. Yes, it's on me, and if I'm in a complicated beat patterns and I miss one, whatever, things can go wrong. But really, it's my job is to empower others. And with the way my personality and my being works, to me, that is something that I feel comfortable doing and I don't get nervous doing. And when it's just me on that stage with the piano, it's a totally different world.
I think you're a born conductor. That would terrify me. Getting up in
Yeah, I
front
mean,
of an
I think
orchestra.
each person is so different, and there are people, of course, who feed off of solo
Hmm.
performance. We all know people who, like, for them, that is the thing where they are most themselves.
Hmm.
It's when it's them and their instrument, and they're just making music on that instrument in a way. And then there are people who feed off of ensemble playing or whatever form it might take. But for me, it's really this.
That's awesome. Yeah, I definitely feel like when I play, it's like I'm much more comfortable playing violin than I am like public speaking or something, or even singing.
Yeah.
I actually did some singing in when I was growing up, and I almost feel like my violin is my little line of defense between my audience and me. It's like
Yeah, well,
I
so
at
often
least know
public
how to do
speaking,
this.
yeah. It's amazing because we're performers, but so many of us, public speaking is the thing that can make you nervous, even though we
Yeah,
speak all the time,
yeah.
right? And it doesn't require the same kind of specialized skill set. No, but actually, early on, as a conductor, you end up having to speak in public all the time. And I remember very early in my career, I ran a new music ensemble, and we'd often talk a little bit between pieces or do little interviews with the composers. And that was the part that made me nervous, not performing the music. It was the having to speak before performing or after performing. And I'd even find myself sometimes performing, but worrying about the speaking I have to do, which is terrible. But over time, of course, I've had to do it so much that now I don't worry about it at
Hmm.
all. And it's become a second nature somehow. But that's something I had to work towards a while with conducting. I think from the beginning, it just felt natural
Hmm.
in my case.
That's amazing. I wanted to ask you about working with Lorin Maazel. I mean, I back in 2012, I actually played in the Castleton Festival Orchestra. We went to Oman and played La Boheme out there. And as a 21-year-old violinist, sitting in that orchestra under Lorin Maazel was at once one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. But I mean, I that is where I learned to play an orchestra. You know,
Yeah.
I forever after that felt comfortable in operas and in orchestra just because the level of attention that he demanded was extraordinary. But then, kind of like how I mentioned with you, it's like he demanded absolute attention from you as a player, and he could tell if you were bullshitting. Like he was not afraid of calling someone out if someone was phoning it in or not paying attention. But then if you did, the performance was seamless. Just the way he interacted with the singers and the orchestra was so, like, obviously for him second nature, and it was extraordinary performing with them in that way. So anyway, and
Yeah, here's
I read in your biography that you'd worked with him a bit, which I actually didn't know before. So I just wanted to hear your take on Lorin Maazel.
Yeah, he was so incredible. So I worked with Mazel actually right before he died in the last year of his life. And I'm sure also that was a very different experience in some ways because I think he felt like he was at the end of his life, and so he really gave it all in a way that was incredible. But what a mind. And also the fact that he started conducting when he was like 10 or
Yeah.
12, like with major orchestras.
Hmm.
So he just knew music in a way that nobody knows music because he lived it, breathed it from before he hit puberty.
Hmm.
I think there are these videos somewhere of like little Mazel in a tuxedo conducting these major pieces and major orchestras. But my first experience meeting Mazel, so I was at Castleton actually, and I arrived and they gave us, I had to cover all of this repertoire, but it was like 40 something hours of music or
Hmm.
more altogether. And I knew some of it already, but most of it was new to me. I was in my, I think, early 20s at the time or mid 20s. And it was so much repertoire. And so I spent months studying it, but it was massive, including several operas. And one of them was Madame Butterfly, which I had never conducted before, but obviously I studied before getting there. And I got there a little bit early, and I wanted to right away see what was happening that day. And the only thing at Castleton happening was some singers sing through of some Butterfly. And I kind of went to it just to check it out and see what the singers were doing. It was great. And the next morning, someone wakes me up at 9 a.m. and says, we need you at 10 a.m. to conduct a Zitz probe of Madame Butterfly. And I'd never conducted Butterfly. I had listened to a few singers from this cast do some of it the night before, but that's it. I had never worked with this orchestra. The orchestra had already had rehearsals on Butterfly, but Maazel wasn't feeling well, or I think actually also he just wanted to kind of see what would happen. I think it was also a sort of test. And an hour later, and I had just an hour, so whatever I knew I had to get dressed and get over there. And so I show up, and here I am just conducting all of Madame Butterfly all the way through. And I was lucky that the players, first of all, were supportive and went along with this, because I think you could be in a situation where people are like, what is this, right? But who were great, and a concertmaster who worked with me collaboratively, right? Yeah, that was Podge, who was amazing. And Apache worked with me, and he realized where I was looking to him to see what the orchestra had been used to doing in the spot, or where I needed to give him something, and also was really willing to follow along and go with me on the interpretive things that I wanted. But yes, there I was conducting Butterfly for the first time ever, and it was the singers' first time with the orchestra, so they were nervous. And it was the orchestra's first time with the singers, and Maazel sitting in the back of the orchestra on a big chair and just sitting there and occasionally waving at me to show me to do something differently to match what he liked or what he was used to. It was absolute trial by fire. I'd never done anything like that. I was very thankful that I had had a lot of opera experience, so at least I knew my way around and could figure it out. And I was very thankful that I had studied the piece extensively before getting there, but that's still not the same. But I have to say, after things like that, you certainly are ready for anything. And in a way, that was the best possible learning experience. And even to have him there in the moment, show me some things, but he never stopped me, because sometimes the way people even teach conducting is they'll stop every 3 bars, which ends up being so discombobulating, and you can't make anything happen. He maybe stopped me once for some specific things, but in general, he didn't stop me. He sat in the back. He showed me visually what he would want in some places if I wasn't doing what he was thinking, like, move this along, I prefer it faster, that sort of thing. And otherwise, he allowed me to do it, and he gave me some thoughts afterwards that informed what I did the next time. But it was the doing in that moment that was the best possible experience, especially at that time in my life. And it also prepared me to be able to just go on and do something with little preparation, because especially as a young conductor, you're so often thrown into a situation where you don't have enough rehearsal time, or somebody else has rehearsed the orchestra and suddenly you're thrown in there to do your thing, or it's a last minute replacement or whatever it is. So being ready for that, I think, is so crucial.
Wow, the Maazel trial by fire.
Yes.
We had a similar situation, because when we got to Castleton, we were asking, well, is there like a seating audition? And they said no. So Maazel is very good at conducting and observing people in the orchestra and kind of seating people that way, just like based on his observations. I'm like, okay. I mean, it puts a little pressure on you when you're just, playing at the first rehearsal, see if he's judging everyone. But I'm like, all right, I've never done it that way before, but here we are. 2 days later, we get a similar email or whatever instruction. 10 o'clock tomorrow, or whatever, noon tomorrow, we're going to have seating auditions.
Oh, wow.
and they sent us some excerpts, and also Movement Solo Bach or whatever it was. And
that was typical Maazel. Maazel. And I'm sure it was by design, because he wanted to see how you do it under pressure in that situation without having the preparation, right? It's
It's
brilliant, but it's great. And I think putting that kind of trust also in young musicians is so important because in real life, in the professional world, as you know, so often you do have to fly by the seat of your pants and make it happen in the moment and be ready for anything, like we said at the beginning, especially in opera, actually. And I think putting that trust and just giving people an opportunity to fail, frankly, or to succeed, or to do some combination of the two, which is usually the case,
yeah.
is itself so important.
Well, that's cool that we got to experience Maazel while he was around.
Yeah. I
Um,
only wish that we had many more years with him because I think he had so much more to give.
yeah, brilliant musical mind and very generous to young
Yes,
musicians.
exceptionally generous.
Um, well, we've gone an hour and 15 minutes or so. Thank you so much for your time. I thought this was an amazing conversation.
Thank you. Thank you. It is so great to catch up and to hear your thoughts on all of this as well. Always so wonderful to connect with other people, especially during this time.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean this podcast has kind of been a little experiment, a little trying something new. And it's my little quarantine project as we have all had different quarantine projects, but conversations like this make me happy and make me think, you know what, I think I'm onto something.
Well, I
So,
love what you're doing, and I learned about some musicians who are new to me also by checking out your podcast. So
oh,
thank you.
thank you very much. So, and I'd love to have you back on anytime if you're working on something new or just to catch up. But yeah, thank you so much, and best best wishes to everything you're doing out there in Chicago.
Thanks so much, Joseph. Great to talk to you. Take
All
care,
right,
stay
take care.
safe, and stay healthy.
You too. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.